Good evening. Welcome to our monthly town hall meeting. Tonight, we continue to pursue a core mission of the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice by learning about the reverse Underground Railroad and the monstrous crimes committed right here in Sussex County. Before I introduce Tom Irving, who is responsible for the production of this evening's program, it is incumbent on me, as the chair of the Alliance, to make a statement regarding the recent but ongoing hateful act committed by law enforcement officers in Liberty County, Georgia, against a group of young women, members of the Delaware State lacrosse team. The Alliance condemns this repetitive pattern of disempowering behavior by those with acquired immunity, behavior which is unacceptable and perhaps criminal, which leaves the recipient of such abuse either traumatized or dead in a country that continues to boast of its democracy despite evidence to the contrary. We will continue to work towards the elimination of racism and all of its corrosive consequences by broadening our programs, raising our voices even louder, and developing new, more assertive strategies to challenge those who continue to deny and abuse the humanity, dignity, and entitlement to all the privileges of citizenship guaranteed to all in the Constitution. You'll hear more from us later in commentaries. But right now, regarding this evening's presentation, we have a preeminent historian and scholar who will explain what it was and the role of Southern Delaware in the reverse Underground Railroad. Dr. Richard Bell's recent book is a spellbinding factual journey through part of what faced African Americans before the Civil War, particularly free people in the North. And I encourage all of you, I'm in the midst of reading it now, to read this spellbinding book. As the Alliance was studying this history last year, it became clear to me, that now in the 21st century, that history was not being told in an honest manner in some places. So earlier this year, the Alliance requested that a very high and prominent public official correct the record. We did that by presenting the detailed history, honest history. It happened. The actions requested by the Alliance were taken, and more. After Dr. Bell's presentation and a panel discussing teaching this history for the first time, we will identify that public official and other senior officials involved. They will be thanked and acknowledged by the Alliance. We will also announce further actions the Alliance will be taking concerning the history of Dr. Bell will be teaching us this evening. To further efforts such as this, the Alliance has formed a history committee, which will frequently present history relevant to the racial justice mission that we all share. Our next history event will be on June 30th, when we will be teaming with the Lewis Public Library and Browse About Books to host Dr. Bell for another different presentation about the reverse Underground Railroad. You can attend in person. You better register soon to get a seat or virtually. You will not regret listening to Dr. Bell again on June 30th. Thanks to Dr. Bell and our partners. And if I don't get the opportunity, thanks to all of you who are participating tonight, our panel, our speaker, and our audience. Thank you for attending this evening to help further the cause of racial justice. And now let me introduce Tom Irving. It's all yours, Tom.
Well, thank you, Charlotte, for the message, especially about DSU and Dr. Bell and his book. Dr. Richard Bell is a preeminent scholar of the 18th and 19th century American history. After earning his BA at the University of Cambridge in England, he received his master's and PhD from Harvard University. Not bad. He teaches at the University of Maryland. The University System of Maryland recently bestowed upon him the Board of Regents Faculty Award for Excellence in Teaching. He's a life member of the Royal Historical Society and many other such organizations. Dr. Bell has published many other books and chapters in books, as well as so many articles that they're difficult to count. Recently, he authored the first chapter of a new book, which is a good read, called The Civil War in Maryland Reconsidered. The chapter he authored, the first chapter, is entitled Border State, Border War, Fighting for Freedom and Slavery in Antebellum, Maryland. Tonight, Dr. Bell will teach us history directly involving Sussex County and the horrendous, vile crimes committed right here. This history is extremely well told in Dr. Bell's most recent book entitled Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home. The book is meticulous history, well told, as Charlotte said. It has won the NEH Scholar Award and was finalist for the George Washington Prize and the Harriet Tubman Prize. In my view, if Dr. Bell had labeled it a novel, it would be a can't put down page turner. After his presentation, Dr. Bell will join a panel to discuss why history like this is relevant today and why it should be taught. And as Charlotte mentioned, he will be back with us on June 30th at the Lewis Public Library. And now we're especially honored to have Dr. Bell with us from his basement because he has COVID. Dr. Bell.
And now he's going to cough to show he has COVID. I've got very mild symptoms of COVID. I'm on day 2 in my basement, hence the slightly weird backdrop today. But thank you for having me, Tom, Charlotte, everyone else who made this event possible. I'm an historian. I live in the past. I live in the 19th century. I don't spend nearly enough time around activists working to build a better today and tomorrow. So this is a rare treat for me to share this work with all of you and to see the ways it intersects with the ongoing work you are working on, which is bearing fruit, as we will hear later on today. Hold tight for that announcement later on. So I am going to talk about my recent scholarship, which has taken the form of a book called Stolen. And in the second half, I'm going to try to bore down on Southern Delaware in particular for a few minutes, given who we all are tonight. So let me go ahead and share my slides here. Let's make sure you can see them as of, give me one second, as of now. I think you can see my slides and hear my voice and see my face. I see Tom nodding, which is a good sign. So I'm going to proceed accordingly. And obviously, as Tom and Charlotte have already intimated, this is very serious and sobering stuff. There are no jokes in here. Cornelius Sinclair was just 10 years old. He was trapped. He was stuck. He was locked in the belly of a small ship that looked a lot like this one. It was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old kid from a spot near Philadelphia's market an hour ago, shoved a black gag into his mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him here. It was dark below the ship's waterline. But Cornelius could see enough to know that he was not the only child locked down there. 4 pairs of eyes stared back at him. 4 other African-American boys. One looked about his size. He was probably 10 or 11, like Cornelius. 2 more were taller, perhaps 14 or 15. The last of them was shorter and smaller than everyone else. He might have been as young as 8. Yesterday, all 5 boys had been free, like you and me. But today they were enslaved. They were prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and labor, most likely to plantation owners in the deep South. If their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property somewhere very far away. He would likely never see his family again. Cornelius disappeared in late August 1825. One of dozens of African-American children to vanish in very similar circumstances from Philadelphia that single year alone. In the early 1800s, that city was the hub of American slavery's blackest market. Its gridded streets and tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings, turning free black kids like Cornelius into Southern slaves. They did their work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time, not only as the city of brotherly love, of course, but also as a safe haven for people of color, and as the headquarters of the American anti-slavery movement. But to criminals, to kidnappers, of course, none of that mattered. And in truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. This was a product of its location. It was the nearest major free soil city on the East Coast to the slave South. Philadelphia lay just 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania from several slave states to its south, including Maryland, where I'm sitting right now. And as Pennsylvania and other northern states had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery in the 50 years after the American Revolution, that boundary running along Pennsylvania's southern border had become ever more important, especially for Black people. By 1825, the year that Cornelius was kidnapped, Pennsylvania's southern border seemed to divide two worlds, separating emerging free soil states in the north from the southern slave states below. Philadelphia's proximity to that frontier line made its many free Black residents attractive targets for professional people snatchers pushing in from nearby states like Maryland and Delaware. And those professional people snatchers preyed on members of Philadelphia's free Black community relentlessly, putting bullseyes on their backs, putting prices on their heads. The people they stole away from freedom could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, three of the new territories and states that were rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time. The American settlers swarming into that region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut sugarcane and pick cotton. They'd take almost anyone to do that unpaid work.
Goodbye.
By the small percentage of their Black laborers from kidnappers of free people may not have been their first choice, but their options as regards supply were limited. Planters down there in the Deep South had been forced to look to American sources for their manpower needs ever since 1808. That's the year that lawmakers in Washington passed legislation outlawing any further imports of Black people from Africa or the Caribbean for the purposes of enslaving them here. That 1808 decision is not very famous, but it was important. It was a major turning point in the history of slavery within America, a turning point that would spur the growth within America of an internal slave trade, a domestic slave trade within the slave states already in the United States. After that 1808 decision, interstate slave traders here in the US would try to satisfy those Southwestern settlers' demand for Black labor by bringing them thousands of American-born enslaved people each year from existing slave states like Maryland and Virginia and Delaware that were in surplus, where there are some slave owners willing to sell some of the Black people they owned as property. And that was all legal, and it was big business, but it wasn't enough. Settlers down in the Deep South wanted even more than that. And the stronger their demand for labor, the more tempting, the more profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free children, like Cornelius, from northern cities like Philadelphia, launder them into that legal supply chain I just described, and then sell them as slaves in this vast new southwestern market. These economic incentives left Philadelphia's large, dynamic, free Black community dangerously exposed. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of a national kidnapping operation, become the northern starting point of something I call America's reverse underground railroad. And so I'll use that phrase a lot tonight, America's reverse underground railroad. And to be clear, it's naming what I just described, the kidnapping and trafficking into slavery of free Black people, usually from northern free soil towns and cities. And this reverse underground railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they ran in opposite directions, of course, right? And they existed for completely opposite reasons. But because they're opposites, they're also sort of mirror images of each other. On the Underground Railroad, the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one, enslaved people would abandon southern plantations and trek usually northwards, dreaming of new lives, new opportunities and freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, free Black people were stolen from northern cities like Philly and made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. On the Underground Railroad, conductors like Harriet Tubman risked their lives and their liberty to help Black fugitives make those epic journeys of freedom. But on America's reverse Underground Railroad, its conductors were kidnappers and human traffickers motivated by money. Both of these networks, one heroic and courageous, one obviously evil and monstrous, both networks roared to life at the same time in the early 1800s to exploit what by then was becoming major differences in the legal status of slavery in the North versus the South. Both networks were loosely organized, opportunistic. Both ran on secrecy and relied on small circles of trusted participants and forged documents and false identities, even disguise. The direction of travel was usually very different, but the routes taken by freedom seekers going north and by victims of kidnapping going south, the routes were largely the same, and they might even have passed one another on certain roads from time to time. And what's more, the volume of traffic on these two metaphorical railroads was also roughly the same size. Each year, each one carried hundreds of Black adults and children across state lines, half of them heading towards freedom, half of them leaving it behind. Most Americans, I hope, know quite a lot about the Underground Railroad by now. Historians have, after all, spent decades studying the strategies and the tactics that Harriet Tubman and her fellow conductors and station agents used to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. The achievements of American heroes like Tubman now command our attention. And there are walking tours, many of them on the Delmarva Peninsula. There are television shows. There are museums. There's a recent movie. There's a TV show, all of it dedicated to celebrating the men and women who created the secret network through which the enslaved could escape to freedom, the Underground Railroad. We know far less about America's reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors, its station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable. And the identities of all but a handful of these criminals still remain a secret, even today. These kidnappers never gave public lectures about their work. These kidnappers never went on fundraising tours. Only rarely do their names or their crimes even appear in police files or trial transcripts. Their low profile and surviving legal sources, the result of the years they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, protected by corruption, protected, I'm sad to say, by too much indifference and apathy among ordinary Americans who knew what they were up to and did nothing to stop it. Unlike some legal slave traders who sometimes donated their papers to Southern colleges and historical societies, the criminal outlaws who built America's reverse Underground Railroad, the kidnappers, they left no business records, no bundles of private letters for historians like me to read and examine. Kidnappers don't write memoirs. Kidnappers don't pose for paintings or photographs, which left journalists and activists of their era to guess, like you see here, as to what they might have looked like. No one posed for this. This is a guess. But despite all that subterfuge, as I argue in my book, Stolen, these professional kidnappers left their mark everywhere on 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where the true story I tell in Stolen begins, but about every northern town or city with a free Black population. If we think not just about 1825, when this true story begins, but about each and every year between 1808 and the Civil War, we can say with depressing certainty that all told, the kidnappers who built America's reverse Underground Railroad stole away likely tens of thousands of free Black people. Many of them children like Cornelius who were under the age of 16. And let me be very clear, most of those they kidnapped were never heard from again. Their families and their friends searched frantically, lobbied, petitioned desperately, even advertised. They waited in earnest for any sort of news, but usually nothing came. Free Black people in northern cities like Philadelphia had very few white allies in this period of American history, beyond the meager ranks of a handful of Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. What's more, white employers openly discriminated against African-American job applicants, while city constables generally ignored people of color's complaints and turned a blind eye to most white on Black street violence. So when kids like Cornelius went missing, their parents could hardly ever persuade mayors or magistrates or policemen to get involved, to do something. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue arrest warrants, to search property, to interrogate suspects. And even then, experienced members of these many different kidnapping crews knew exactly what to do, exactly what to say, to talk their way out of trouble and to get back to work. We have, I think, let's see, 49 households logged in right now. Hello to all of you. I'm guessing all of you here have heard of 12 Years a Slave. As you'll remember, 12 Years a Slave was the name of a movie based on a memoir by a guy named Solomon Northup, who of course was one of the tens of thousands of victims of America's reverse Underground Railroad. However, unlike almost everyone else, Northup later escaped his enslavement. It took him 12 years to do it, but he did it. And when he did it, he returned home and then he wrote about it all. And in that memoir, written in 1853, 12 Years a Slave, Northup explains what riding America's reverse Underground Railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of excuse me, he explains how a pair of well-dressed white con men lured him into New York City from his home upstate in 1841. And at the time, Northup was a well-educated, literate, prosperous musician in his mid-30s. In Manhattan, the con men wined him and dined him. And if you remember the movie, they drugged him. And then they sold him to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C. Northup was soon forced onto a slave ship bound for New Orleans. And there he was sold in one of that city's infamous slave showrooms to a planter who then put him to work in his cane fields. 9 years ago, in 2013, that Oscar-winning film, based on Northup's extraordinary autobiography, drew overdue attention to his ordeal. But both the memoir and the extraordinary movie offer distorted and perhaps misleading views of the people whom the agents of America's reverse Underground Railroad usually targeted and how those agents usually made their money. It turns out that Northup's experience on the reverse Underground Railroad was not at all typical of everyone else's. The railroad's kidnappers rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Solomon Northup. No. They preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with tricks that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of their captives traveled by ship to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls to trek southward on foot in small, specialized overland human convoys known as coffles, after the Arabic word for caravan. And their prisoners rarely ended up in showrooms or on the auction block. No, their prisoners were vastly more likely to be sold off along the way in ones or twos, in furtive, all-cash deals to hard-up planters in the interior of Mississippi or Alabama, to men who wanted to buy more human beings, but who were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. All of that was what was typical on the reverse Underground Railroad. And all of that is almost exactly what happened to Cornelius Sinclair. In August of 1825, Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors hustled them onto a ship just outside Philadelphia, in the top right here, of course. Their captors warehoused them for a while in a pair of safe houses down on the Delaware-Maryland line, just above the word Nanticoke at the bottom of your screen, your neck of the woods. And then they marched them halfway across this vast continent toward the Deep South, where they tried to sell all 5 free children as slaves. It was a soul-destroying journey. A journey of 2 million steps. I have a lot to say about it in the book, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pass over this journey. And likewise, at my publisher's request, I'm going to pass over much of the book's second half, in which we learn that some, though not all, of these 5 boys make a miraculous escape. A miraculous escape. And they begin the astonishing odyssey home to Philadelphia, teased in the book's subtitle. All I can say here is that what Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe made happen was indeed astonishing to them and to me. The story of them trying to get free and return home would involve 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies from the earth, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, America's largest manhunt so far. Now, I want to pivot here to southern Delaware for obvious reasons. The gang that stole Cornelius was led by 2 white men, whose names were Jesse Cannon and Joseph Johnson. In fact, by the time they steal these 5 boys, Jesse Cannon is dead and his widow has taken over. But for much of the gang's existence, it's led by Joseph Johnson and Jesse Cannon. And it was their habit to warehouse most children they kidnapped from Philadelphia in the attics of their houses, which were out near the Maryland-Delaware line in a remote, underpopulated corner of the Delmarva Peninsula. And they would keep these kids captive there for weeks at a time, for however long it took them to organize the children's onward journey across the country and into the Deep South where they could be sold as slaves. There are lots of unanswered questions about the reverse Underground Railroad in general, and plenty in particular about how gangs like the Cannon-Johnson gang used private homes in Southern Maryland and Delaware as prisons. How they prevented kids warehoused inside them from escaping. Why neighbors in Southern Delaware or Eastern Maryland failed to sound the alarm, and why law enforcement never successfully raided these properties. One of the breakthroughs I had in the course of my research for this book came back in, I think, 2013, when I came across a letter written to the officers of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society by their own chief investigator in 1819. And I think this letter sheds light on some of the questions I just raised. So for the next few minutes, if you'll humor me, I'm going to tell you, using a mixture of direct quotation and my own words, what that letter said. And then when I'm done, we're going to reflect about what it reveals about how this particular gang of kidnappers and human traffickers from your neck of the woods operated, and fundamentally how they got away with it all for so long. So listen up. In May of 1819, 6 years before Cornelius and the 4 other boys would vanish from Philadelphia's streets, Sarah Hagerman, a free Black girl aged 11, disappeared from her job near the waterworks just outside that city. After her widowed mother made a public appeal for information, a tip-off led to the arrest of Sarah's employer, a woman named Margaret Ward. At her trial that October, Margaret Ward confessed that she had sold Sarah, who was free, remember, to a stolen goods dealer, who had then sold this girl on to Jesse Cannon out on Maryland's eastern shore. 2 weeks later, in early November, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society dispatched John Willits out to Maryland's eastern shore to try to rescue Sarah Hagerman. John Willits was a dogged and experienced private detective. He arrived in Denton, Maryland on November the 13th. He brought with him a man named Miller who knew young Sarah Hagerman and who hoped to be able to physically identify this child by a scar that she had on her forehead and another scar she had on one of her knees. But these 2 men ran into trouble in Eastern Maryland almost immediately. The sheriff in Denton, who said he was disgusted by this detestable traffic in kidnapped children, informed them that the man they were looking for, this Jesse Cannon, actually lived beyond the sheriff's jurisdiction, just across the state line in Sussex County, Delaware. It took Detective Willits another full day to track down a Delaware judge willing to issue a warrant to search Cannon's house, and then a second day to persuade a Delaware constable to actually execute that order. The Delaware officer in question, a constable named Robeson, was none too keen to do so. He'd heard that Joseph Johnson, Jesse Cannon's partner and son-in-law, had holed up in the same house as Cannon, and that both of these men were likely to be armed and dangerous. The private eye, the family friend, and the reluctant local constable arrived at Jesse Cannon's house on horseback on November the 15th, as the day was turning to dusk. Peering through the back door, Willits, the private eye, saw 3 or 4 small black girls inside, although none seemed to match Sarah's description. Miller, the family friend, a few paces behind, thought he caught a glimpse of Sarah disappearing through the house's back garden and into the woods with some men. But before Miller could follow her, Joseph Johnson suddenly darted from behind a corner of the house and, presenting a pistol to Miller's head, swore that if he attempted to advance another step, he would blow his brains out. Joseph Johnson demanded to know their business. "What are you doing here?" Without dropping his gun, he peered at the search warrant Detective Willits had in hand, but declared that warrant to be void because the sun was set, he said, and the day was therefore over, which is nonsense. And he swore to shoot the first man who should attempt to raise a latch on any door anywhere in the house. Only at the private eye's prodding did the reluctant constable insist that the warrant was good till midnight. The sun setting is not the end of the day. This warrant is still good. Johnson had to accept that, but he really gave no more than he had to. He allowed Constable Robeson and Mr. Miller to search the place for Sarah Hagerman, but only on condition that no questions should be asked of any other Black people they might discover inside. While Detective Willits remained at the door, Constable Robeson and Mr. Miller ventured upstairs, with Joseph Johnson and his father-in-law, Jesse Cannon, attending them with cocked pistols in their hands. Imagine trying to search your property while there's a gun pointed at you. When Joseph Johnson unbolted the door leading to the second-floor attic, Constable Robeson and Mr. Miller came face to face with 5 Black women bound together by heavy chains. They sat in terrified silence around a cold fireplace. With Jesse Cannon's pistol pressed to his head, Mr. Miller hastily inspected each of them, looking for Sarah Hagerman's telltale scars. As he passed among them, each person's face became faintly illuminated by a transient hope that she would be claimed, only to immediately relapse again into the settled features of despair as she saw him pass on without the ability to save her. None of these 5 women was Sarah Hagerman. They were all too old, all of them teenagers by Miller's reckoning. Sarah's 11, remember. He and the others continued their house search for a few more minutes. But Sarah Hagerman was nowhere to be found. Joseph Johnson and Jesse Cannon seemed to be enjoying watching this rescue mission fail. And they snidely insisted that their visitors should go ahead and examine the outbuildings on the property as well. So they did. And inside one shack in the yard, Detective Willits found 2 Black boys and 3 more Black girls. None of them bore Sarah's marks. By then, it was obvious that they were not going to find her. Sarah's captors had evidently heard that their posse was coming and had hustled Sarah off the property before they'd arrived. Night was falling fast now, and with no hopes of finding the girl now remaining, Detective Willits, Constable Robeson, and Mr. Miller soon had to give up and go home. In lantern light, they retreated to their horses as Jesse Cannon and Joseph Johnson jeered and hollered at them. The next morning, Willits and Miller returned to Philadelphia empty-handed. No one in Sarah Hagerman's family ever heard from her again. As a reminder, we know all this because of the report that Willits submitted 2 weeks later to his bosses at the Abolition Society. That's the source I've been quoting here these past few minutes. And as you've heard, it is sobering stuff, but it's also pretty revealing, I think, just to riff on this for a couple of minutes, what does it reveal? You know, if we weren't in webinar, if we were face to face and I was coughing all over you, spewing COVID at a super spreader event, I would say, what does this reveal? What did you learn about how this gang operates? About how this gang, the same gang that will kidnap Cornelius 6 years later, how they were able to operate successfully for so long? Well, here's my own very quick and dirty summary of some of that report's takeaways. As you've noticed, you know, rather than record a daring and triumphant rescue, it instead offers rare first-hand testimony as to the limits of law enforcement's powers in this time and this place. It also sheds light upon the size of Jesse Cannon and Joseph Johnson's operations out there. They had lots of people chained up on their property. And it sheds light upon the efficacy of the tactics they used to protect their black market business and preserve their own liberty, to not get arrested. Despite his years of experience as a private investigator, Willits struggled mightily to even gain the element of surprise. It also struggled, remember, to secure a search warrant and to persuade county constables to do their job and enforce it. This kidnapping gang's leaders, Jesse Cannon and Joseph Johnson, were evidently well connected locally and much feared locally. And they had beaten the investigator easily. Discovering Detective Willits' report was a godsend for me. It didn't feature Cornelius, and it took place in 1819, not 1825. But it nonetheless provided a way to illuminate a shadowy part of the experience that Cornelius and the four other boys would have gone through when they arrived in this same house in Sussex County, Delaware, as captives 6 years later in 1825. And I mention this in so much detail because I want you to understand why historians have written so little so far about the reverse Underground Railroad. The problem, of course, is sources, documents, evidence. We need evidence. Remember, the oldest of the 5 boys I write about in my book, a boy named Sam, was only 15 when he vanished. The rest, like Cornelius, were much younger. One of these boys was homeless when he was kidnapped. The other 4 came from families in different degrees of destitution, poverty. Most of them could not read or write. They were not the sort of people to leave behind many traces in libraries and archives. And that is a problem because this is a true story, and historians need sources, lots of them, to reconstruct past lives in ways that are true and fair. The stories and struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind them rich troves of papers and diaries and memoirs often remain untold and unstudied if there's a lack of readily available evidence. So what do you do? Well, to reconstruct Cornelius's journey along America's reverse Underground Railroad, I began by wringing what I could from a small packet of letters written to or from the mayor of Philadelphia, this guy, a man who wades into this story belatedly, almost too late, and wringing what I could from coverage of Cornelius's disappearance in a single anti-slavery magazine that took an interest. And for the record, historians have known about those 2 sources for some time, the mayor's letters, the anti-slavery magazine, but on their own, they turn out to be too few and thin to sustain a whole book-length reconstruction of this astonishing odyssey into and out of slavery. So I've had to keep going, to look elsewhere, digging around in almost any archive I could think of for scraps of information that, when stitched together, could help build this all out. And along the way, there've been lots of days spent finding nothing at all. Looking for needles in haystacks, but finding only more hay. If you've done your own historical or genealogical research, you've probably experienced that feeling. But you should keep at it, right? Because ultimately, I think it's definitely been worth it for me. Over 6 years of research for this book, I unearthed dozens and dozens of needles buried in those stacks of hay. New sources about this case, buried within 35 archives in 14 states and the District of Columbia, multiple archives in Delaware, by the way, led by the state archives in Dover and the Delaware Historical Society in Wilmington. Now, the good news for you is I'm not going to list off all the new sources I found. That would take a while. But I am going to highlight just 3, just to give you a sense of what I found. One thing I found was the handwritten notes of a trial that took place down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. A trial which decided the fate of one of these boys, the fate of Cornelius, actually. I also discovered a pair of letters in which one of these kidnappers names his accomplices and describes their role in this kidnapping case. An astonishing find. People think I made it up. I didn't. I even copied it into the back of the book so you can read it for yourself. But most affectingly of all, at least for me, was this. A missing persons notice published in a local paper by Cornelius's grieving father. It's short, so I can read it for you. It says, boy lost. The subscriber's son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday. And as he had no cause and had never before absented himself, it's feared he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. My son is a very dark-skinned, mixed-race lad. He's pretty stout built. He's got thin, long fingers. His eyes are weak. His left eye is smaller than his right. Any person hearing of our son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at this address, Joseph Sinclair. As you can imagine, I've read this missing persons ad hundreds of times in my life. And every time I can't help but notice 2 words that seem like they're flashing in neon at me, like they're written 60 foot high. Afflicted parents. All of us are children of parents. Many of us are parents of children. I'm in my basement. Upstairs is my 5-year-old and my 8-year-old. The thought that my children could be taken from my wife and I, and there'd be nothing we could do to get them back, just rips at me in a really primal human way. Afflicted parents. It's the understatement of the 19th century. So before I seek your questions, and we're going to have a conversation with 2 other panelists in which some of the questions that people often have, I'm sure, are going to come out, like, how do we connect this to the work of the Alliance? I want to wrap up with a couple of reflections these last 2 minutes about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important, and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on that railroad is worth your time. Now, to begin with, I would argue forcefully that Black lives have always mattered. And so any true story about free children ripped from their families and swallowed up by American slavery is worth reconstructing for its own damning sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands our attention for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent in northern towns and cities. And Black freedom was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free people played in accelerating the spread of American slavery into the Deep South over the same period. Now, as I said, I'm not at liberty to spill all the beans about the book's astonishing second half. The publisher does want you to look at a copy, or to tell you exactly what happened to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked into Alabama. But I am going to drop a few big hints. And I am going to tell you that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save Cornelius and the 4 other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies and the aftermath of their campaign would radicalize free Black communities across the northern states, inspiring African Americans to embrace bold new tactics in the cause of their own mutual protection and self-defense. And their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well, by encouraging white abolitionists like the 2 white women who wrote this children's anti-slavery alphabet to focus the northern reading public's attention on the suffering of Black families forcibly separated by kidnappers, but also by slave catchers and slave traders and by slavery itself. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough, new, anti-kidnapping measure known as a personal liberty law. And this 1826 Pennsylvania personal liberty law would enrage Southerners and slaveholders more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War. And it set in motion a chain of court challenges to it and political retaliations against it that culminated in the passage through Congress of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a pro-slavery abomination that put this country on a collision course with civil war. To conclude, Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a rider on America's reverse Underground Railroad was the result of the meeting of massive economic and political forces. And what happened to him, and the thing that he and the other 4 boys made happen next, would, as I've just suggested, usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in the United States. But that lasting legacy should never be allowed to obscure the urgent stakes of his particular story. In 1825, a 10-year-old boy and 4 other children were dragged into slavery. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape. So I'm going to pause there. In a second, I'm going to hand back, but I just want to point out that this book is available in all libraries and wherever books are sold. If for some reason you'd like a signed copy, feel free to drop me an email. Likewise, if you have a question about something I said today, dropping me an email is a great way to get a substantial answer to it. rjbell@umd.edu. I know we have a busy program on tonight's town hall, so I'm going to hand back. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, wow, Dr. Bell, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Now we're going to address the question you've raised. Why learn this old history? You say you live in the 19th century, the 18th century. Well, why? Does it matter? What relevance does it have to now? So we're going to add to the panel now Dr. Melinda Hudson. Dr. Hudson is a department chair at a local community college, as well as being a member of the Alliance Steering Committee, and also Erica Novak, who is also an experienced educator, a graduate degreed educator, who's also a member of the Alliance Steering Committee and chairs the Alliance's important education committee. So Dr. Hudson.
Thank you, Tom. So It is okay. It's okay to call you Rick, right?
Sure, yes.
So you, one of the questions that I have is basically what Tom just said. What is the relevance, or what do you see as being the significance of teaching this type of history today and making our elementary, our middle school children, making everyone aware of the whole history, the whole and the entire American history? What do you feel is the relevance? What impresses? What is the significance of us having this information today?
So first of all, thank you, Melinda. I appreciate the question. I'll say, first of all, I think, all of us will probably have a different answer to that question. As with any historical topic, we will each see different things in it that resonate with the way we see the world today. That's one of the great gifts of history, right? It speaks to all of us differently. But for me, one of the first critical contexts that jumps to mind is what can politely be called the history wars today, that we are currently, meaning in the last 5 years, in a very acute stage of taking some steps back from taking a hard look at America's difficult history. There are laws on the books in more than a dozen states passed in recent years. And by the way, parenthetically, I'm just speaking for myself in these remarks, not for my employer or for the Alliance. There are rules on the books in more than a dozen states which seek to fundamentally whitewash the instruction and telling of American history and all its complexity in our K-12 schools. And you've seen attempts to ban certain books covering some of these historical topics in various curriculum, even from public libraries, for goodness sake. So I see that as a retrograde step. I see that as an opportunity to put our heads in the sand and say la, 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 and to tell only the most simplistic one-sided stories about how the country in which we all live today became that country, and to ignore some of the deep structures of racism and inequality and the great shadow of slavery in the post-slavery United States. So I think anytime any scholar or any teacher is telling complicated stories about America's past, they're doing their students a service, and I hope to contribute a small part to doing that. More narrowly, of course, regarding the subject matter here, one of the things that the story of the reverse Underground Railroad shines a light on has to do less with the slave South, which has not had good press, of course, for a long time, and rightly so, but more to do with the Free Soil North. And one of the things that we learn is that gangs like the Cannon-Johnson gang, which operated in a slave state, Delaware, and a slave state, Maryland, it could get away with the terrible things it was doing in Philadelphia because of the complicity of a great many free white residents of that city who turned a blind eye, who literally did nothing when they saw kidnappings in progress, who did not walk over to intervene, who did not tell police constables to get involved, who did not make sure to elect candidates who would give a damn on that stuff. So we're reminded through the reverse Underground Railroad that while the North was slowly emerging after the revolution as free soil space, places where slavery is in decline or dying, that does not mean that racism was in decline or dying north of Delaware or north of Maryland. You can legislate against slavery. It's much harder to legislate racism away. So that reveals a more complicated story about the North versus the South, the good North versus the evil South, which I think we can all learn something from. And then you cannot be reminded of the human cost of enslavement you cannot but be reminded of the human cost of enslavement in a story like this. I love the 12 Years a Slave movie. It's a brilliant piece of cinema. Everyone should see it. It deserved to win Best Picture. But fundamentally, children were the ones being kidnapped and stolen away from freedom. And if you can't be motivated to build a better world by watching children suffer, then what the hell's wrong with you?
I agree thoroughly.
I think it's very important what you just said about the parallels of the time, because we do tend to think about and study history in terms of the war, of the moments of those huge conflict and change. But the book like this helps highlight all the terror and the drama of the in-between moments and all the important things that are happening under the surface. And there's parallels to right now. But you did just now also mention the children. And so, it's the children. And I've got a large background with middle school and high school age children. So is content like this appropriate for this age? It happened to kids this age. Is it appropriate? Would parents agree that it's appropriate for them to study it? What do you think?
Oh, if that's directed at me, Erica, first of all, thank you for that. I appreciate it. So I think, at home, parents should make their own decisions about what's appropriate for their children. And in school, I think teachers and professionals should make those judgments about what is grade level appropriate in a structured educational environment. Home and school are different, and it's perfectly reasonable for different standards to be operative in different contexts. What I can tell you is that this book's been out for one pandemic so far, for a couple of years, and it's had great take up at different levels, most especially at the college level, where I'm pleased to say, staring American history in the face is the bread and butter of every practicing historian. But it's also done, I think really well in 10th, 11th, 12th grade high school environments as well. We produced a teacher's guide, a curriculum guide for it, which speaks to learning outcomes and standards, and offers lots of sort of open-ended critical reading questions to facilitate and encourage discussion, which are not prescriptive or heavy handed. If there's any educators watching this who'd like to get a copy of that curricular teacher's guide, just send me an email, rjbell@umd.edu. I'll forward it to you. So I leave it to educators to just decide whether they want to assign it. This is hard stuff, but I generally take the view, and you've heard me say this in response to Melinda, that sugarcoating American history with the next generation of American citizens can be hugely counterproductive in the long term. We want to raise a generation of citizens who want to make this country work for everyone, and so they need to understand how we got here.
And as an experienced educator, I would certainly add that teachers have training in addressing many layers of topics in a developmentally appropriate way with students. So I've taught literature for many years, and we can teach all different topics with sensitivity to different age groups. But I'm delighted to hear that there's a guide in the works for such an important book.
We're gonna have another question. You mentioned the lack of historical evidence when it comes to the reverse Underground Railroad and the atrocities that people, that especially young Black people, suffered as being stolen and taken back to slavery. Based on what we have or what we don't have insofar as history is concerned, and this is another question about academics, but what do you think, in your opinion, is the real issue with critical race theory then?
Yeah, wow, you're trying to get me in trouble tonight, Melinda. All right. So there is a disconnect in our public debate about critical race theory as to how scholars use the term and have used the term for decades in law schools where this term originated, and the way it's being used in mass media, especially conservative mass media like Fox News. And so what's being discussed in public is at best a caricature of what critical race theory actually is. At worst, it's fiction. So critical race theory, as originated in law schools like Harvard and Columbia and UCLA in the 1970s and 1980s by a team of gifted constitutional scholars like Derek Bell, who's not related to me and who is Black, and Marie Matsuda and Richard Delgado and Kimberly Crenshaw, is a set of premises designed to interrogate the long legacy of racism in post-civil rights America. So they looked around in the 1970s and said, okay, well, in the 1960s, we'd had all this progress in the law, right? There was Brown v. Board of Education, there was the Civil Rights Act, there was the Voting Rights Act. Look at the progress we've made. We have legislated racism away. And yet by the 1970s, those scholars were looking around and said, why has not racism gone away then? Why have these laws, in fact, either been unenforced or chipped away at in the courts or countermanded in state legislatures? Why has there been such a pull away from creating the sort of justice for all that these laws seem to imagine and intend? And so their answer, which was really a series of questions rather than answers, was to shine a light on sort of the creation of institutional racism, the idea that we can put policies in place that over time can produce racialized outcomes, even if the people enforcing those laws are not themselves racist, right? You don't need people in white hoods to produce racialized outcomes that disadvantage Black and brown people if the policies are written in such a way that disadvantaging those groups are the most likely outcome. So there's lots of examples of this, folks, stretching back before the 1960s. If you know what redlining is, these are policies, I know you guys do, these are policies put in place to determine how good a loan you get if you want to buy a house, and codes urban geographies by risk factor for the loan repayment. And it just so happens that inner cities got flagged as red zones where the risk of a federal loan being repaid was considered higher. And it just so happened that Black and brown people lived in those red-lined zones. So the cost of borrowing for Black and brown lenders was suddenly much higher than for a person in a non-red line zone area, right? So it's not actually about race, it's about risk of mortgage repayment, but it produces racialized outcomes. That's the famous example of this sort of officially colorblind, in practice not colorblind at all, policy. And there's lots of examples in education policy as well, which I'm sure Erica knows a great deal about. There's voting rights legislation, which seems to limit where polling places are open, how many polling days are open, whether you can vote on Sunday or not, which have nothing to do with race, of course, but seem to practically most disadvantage Black and brown voters. So, CRT scholars, critical race theory scholars, would point to these things and say, these things don't just happen by accident, and they produce outsized long-term consequences. Now, I don't think that's how critical race theory is being discussed in conservative mass media. I think critical race theory is being thrown around like a catch-all bogeyman to demonize anyone who attempts to tell the truth about American history or to have a serious conversation about the legacies of slavery and racism in this country. And we could debate the reasons why there's that disconnect there, but that's the cleanest explanation I can offer off the top of my head about what CRT actually is and how it's simply become a way to stop educators doing their job, which is to tell the truth about America and create better citizens so America can be better for everyone.
Thank you. Erica, did you have a question?
I really appreciate that this book has a little bit of, I think, the both pieces that are needed. in the way that we'd like to see the evolution of history in America, which you were just referencing, becoming not just moments of teaching about Black history, but Black history being integrated more fully into American history. And that is highlighting both the faults of our nation, but also Black achievement. So I know you hinted a little bit about the second half of your book, but I'm wondering if you could just highlight for us a little bit more about some of, as people are maybe considering reading it or teaching it, is there some hope?
Yes, there's hope. There's hope. I mean, there's always hope, right? There's always hope. I talk about very sobering things every day of my professional life. I'm also a relentlessly optimistic person who thinks we all have it within us to do better every day than we did yesterday. And that's why I keep saying, you know, how we educate the nation's youth to make them better equipped to face these challenges is so important, right? We all want America to work better for everyone. The second half of this book, strange, crazy, unexpected things happen, which did not normally happen to in other cases of kidnapping. As I said in the talk, most cases of kidnapping are, from the kidnapper's point of view, successful. They're able to spirit someone away, usually someone either, you know, physically or politically weak, a child or a young person, get them far away quickly, and then sell them at a giant profit, obviously, into a place and into a labor system from which it's almost impossible to escape. If you are, let's say, Erica, an 11-year-old boy from Philadelphia, and you are sold into slavery in Alabama, what are your chances of getting free? What are your chances of knowing where to go or whom to trust or what your rights are, or if you know what a right is, or if you have any? So the chances that victims of kidnapping, especially those younger, are going to get their day in court, or, you know, file a freedom suit and persuade a judge that they're illegally kidnapped and that they must be freed, or that, you know, some white saviors on horses are going to gallop down from the free north and pluck them out of enslavement and carry them back to freedom for a tearful reunion. That sounds like fantasy talk. And yet many of those things happen in this book.
Well, let's look at the Confederate statues as an example. You know, how after all those Jim Crow statues, after all those years, how does education play into their removal?
How does education play into the removal? Yes, so right. So that is a hard pivot, as we say. It has been. I've been on a real reckoning journey, Tom, with the Confederate statues. If you asked me 5 years ago, Tom, I would say that taking them down is a way of whitewashing America's history, and we shouldn't whitewash American history. We need to stare the Confederacy in the face. But talking to more people of color about what confronting those statues, which symbolize anti-Black hatred, does, has really clarified my thinking. And to see how staring America's history in the face has helped us understand that most of those statues were put up not during the period of the Confederate States' existence, in the 4 years it existed, and not necessarily in states that were part of the Confederacy, like Maryland, where I live, which was not part of the Confederacy, has helped me, you know, see those statues in a whole different and even more toxic light here. And it's helped shine a spotlight on the legacy of, you know, pro-slavery racism in the Jim Crow era, right? We too often write off the Jim Crow era as a sequel to the slavery period, thinking that we did the job of eliminating slavery and it's all sunshine and rainbows after that. But that's when those Confederate statues actually going up in the 1880s and 1890s. And so I think they've had their turn.
We've got a couple questions in the chat. Kay has one. I'm not sure which one came in first. We have one from Calvin and then one from Clara. Kay is asking, what can we do to get the neighborhood name for cannons renamed, as well as the road and neighborhoods called plantations? And I think she's referring to areas in West Seaford. Is that right, Tom?
Yes, that's right. But that takes it to the next step past statutes about, street names and place names and subdivision names and things like that, like a subdivision called Patty Cannon Estates right here in Sussex County. A lot has been written about that. It was named by a developer about 50 years ago. And there was a big article just earlier this year about people in the neighborhood didn't really know what it was named after.
Yeah, and I'll just say very narrowly here, Tom, in response to this question, that as I was doing research for this book, about 5 or 6 years ago, making all these research trips to areas like Seaford, I remember going to, I think, the Seaford Museum and seeing that there was a brief exhibit about Patty Cannon, which seemed mostly laudatory, mostly sort of, gee whiz, we had a prolific evildoer in our midst, like it's like she's our Jack the Ripper, aren't we cool? Which always struck me as at best unsightly and at worst vastly problematic. And then to see things named after Patty Cannon around Southern Delaware and Eastern Maryland also always struck a very discordant note. And so one of my goals for this book is that it brings a greater awareness to people who've actually already heard the name over in your neck of the woods as to the extent of her monstrosity, that she's not someone to be proud of or to celebrate.
And one of the questions because you could go on for hours about the book, but Clara's question is, you talked about Patty Cannon's son-in-law and her husband, who she probably murdered, but how come she's the one who's on the signs?
Yeah,
and not the evildoers you mentioned?
So there's all sorts of evildoers in this gang. It's a family affair, right? It's an interconnected, intergenerational family. They're all utterly complicit in this. But the fact that this gang is co-run for about 7 years of its 20-year existence by a woman, by the widow of the previous gang leader, is actually pretty unusual. You can find lots of kidnapping gangs in America at this time, but to have anything run by a woman, especially a woman who I think by that time was in her 60s, is quite remarkable. I'm not praising that, I'm just saying it's unusual. And so the fact that she's seems to be breaking out of 19th century gender roles by assuming a leadership position, that's the one part of her story that people seem to have really resonated with and put her up on a sort of pedestal for being a sort of female trailblazer. But what you of course forget is all the human trafficking and immiseration of other human beings that came along with that role.
And that takes us to the next part of the program, and everybody will hang around and comment on it. But now it's time to tell about what Charlotte King mentioned about something very good that has happened about the Patty Cannon history, and then and I'd like you all to comment on it after I get through that, because we've learned about Patty Cannon and her gang from Dr. Bell this evening, and as Charlotte noted, our research discovered that Patty Cannon was actually being glorified or downplayed right now in the 21st century, right here in Sussex County and in Southern Maryland and on the Eastern Shore. So we took some action. On January 31st of this year, we sent a letter to Governor Hogan of Maryland. And the letter asked the question in the Ray line. It says, why is Maryland honoring a human trafficker in American children? That was designed to get the attention of the governor. Why is Maryland honoring a human trafficker in American children? And the letter said, Dear Governor Hogan, a Maryland highway marker, not quite a statue, but a public thing, a Maryland highway marker notes and honors a horrific human trafficker and free African Americans, particularly children. It must be removed. And we note in the letter, Patty Cannon and the Cannon-Johnson gang, which operated about 200 years ago, must not be honored with a misleading highway marker. Maryland and Delaware must work together to tell the true history of a vile criminal gang. The letter went on to explain the facts and introduce him to the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. A copy of the first page of the letter is up on the screen. We engaged with Maryland officials. Much to their credit, a little over 2 months later, much faster than we anticipated, we were contacted by Allison Mayer, who's Deputy Chief of Staff for Infrastructure in the governor's office, in Governor Hogan's office, who told us, quote, the State Highway Administration intends to remove the marker as it is not in keeping with our mission, and we plan to engage stakeholders like your organization on a replacement. Then we got a letter from Secretary James Potts, who is the head of the Maryland Department of Transportation, a very high position in Maryland, who wrote saying, quote, our goal is to maintain a historic highway marker program that reflects our state's diversity and historical truths. Patty Cannon's house, historical highway marker, runs contrary to our mission, and we will be removing that marker from our highway. Secretary Potts went on to say, quote, the state of Maryland appreciates the efforts of the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice as advocates of racial justice, equality, and opportunity. At this time, we would like to invite representatives of your organization to meet with state representatives to discuss, end quote, how to deal with all of this. We soon got a note from Dr. Julie Shablitsky, who's the Chief of Cultural Resources of McDOT. She's an Eastern Shore native who was one of the people who found the location of Harriet Tubman's father's cabin. She said to us, quote, as the Secretary's letter states, we are happy to meet with you and others regarding a new sign that educates the traveling public about the Underground Railroad. Thank you for your leadership and important work you do in Southern Delaware. Elizabeth Hughes, who is Maryland's State Historic Preservation Officer, the SHPO, was also involved, as were many other important members of the Hogan administration. True to their word, on April 20th, just a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Shablitsky sent a note saying, quote, I want to let you know that the Patty Cannon House marker has been removed. Thank you for notifying us, end quote. So the Alliance sincerely thanks Governor Hogan and the incredible professionals mentioned above for taking this decisive action concerning a highway marker about Patty Cannon, which stood about 100 yards from the Delaware border west of Seaford, Delaware. These are exceptional actions by Maryland, akin to the Confederate statues. The Alliance will be further thanking Maryland. The Alliance will be taking up Maryland on its offer for us to participate in properly and widely telling of the history of the reverse Underground Railroad. During this same research, we discovered similar errors of omission and commission in Delaware, such as that museum. We can do better. In Delaware, Patty Cannon is also glorified and the depth of her depravity downplayed in some places. The Alliance will be contacting appropriate authorities to seek corrections. We'll be contacting Governor Carney, DelDOT, and other agencies devoted to history to join with us and Maryland in correcting errors and properly telling the story of the reverse Underground Railroad. We'll shortly be telling you of those efforts. So thank you, Dr. Bell, for writing the book and helping out, which was a big key to the research we've been doing for quite some time. We'll be having more programs on history and continue to broaden the education and other efforts. So it may seem like a highway sign is not a lot, but it glorified Patty Cannon, who was a monster, and now it's gone. So progress.
This is the definition of progress. This is why I should spend more time with activists, because you guys do amazing things, which make me so excited to be even a little bit player in this. You guys have amazing leaders here doing extraordinary things. And I agree that public history matters a great deal. And for one state of this union to take a position on this point is wonderful in and of itself. And it's surely the beginning, I think, of sustained action from the state of Delaware and associated agencies. Several people in the chat are also wondering, about private business entities and so on. And I know, Tom, that's something you've been thinking about as well.
Yeah, there are private businesses, but just like with subdivisions, that's private. We hope that by making this history more public, people will want to change their names. They will want, because we can't make somebody change the name of a subdivision or the plantation subdivision or plantation road, all of those things. But knowing history might have something to do with it.
I'll just say very quickly on the plantations question that someone raised in the chat, the language we use in and around enslavement has rightly been reconceived in recent years. Notice, for instance, that when I speak, I tend to say enslavement rather than slavery, if I can, to remind you that it's a process done to someone by someone else. I tend to say an enslaved person rather than a slave, because a person is not a thing. I tend to say enslaver when I can, rather than slave owner or planter or master, to remind you of what these people did to other human beings. And plantations is still an overly romanticized word. It's an accurate description of the agricultural planting that went on, but it also obscures all the suffering and enslavement that goes along with agricultural planting. So I tend not to use the word plantation anymore. I tend to use the word slave labor camp as a synonym. And I think every time you see the word plantation on a subdivision, ask yourself if it would be as attractive if it was called slave labor camp row or something else, because that's what happened on plantations. They were slave labor camp.
That's a good point. And Alicia asks if there were any private developments in Maryland named after the cannons. There was a private business, a fairly substantial private business that used the cannon name, and we called attention to them as to what Patty Cannon stood for, and they have requested no publicity, but they've changed the name even on all the corporate records. So there is more than that one highway sign, but we have to honor the request of some people who've done some things, and they've all said the same thing. All we did is what's right. We don't want publicity. And your language lesson is good. Thank you.
Tom, while you have a pregnant pause, I'd like to invite Dr. Bell to join the Alliance, or at least join our New History committee, which Tom is going to lead. I think working together would accelerate the work that Tom wants to do in Delaware. So
I'd of course be delighted, Charlotte. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Yes, and we're hoping that Governor Hogan's office and succeeding governors call on you to fix everything in Maryland.
Yes.
But we have, let's see. Oh, and let me, we'll finish off by reminding everybody that we are going to have more programs. Charlotte has charged us with doing something quarterly. And we're going to try to do that. There's a lot of history, so quarterly we should be able to fill up. But anyone listening, the Alliance has committees on education, excursion, communication, outreach, legislative, history, and more. They're all worthwhile, and they're interesting, and they all have a lot of nice people. It's a good effort. Everybody can, whatever time, you have an hour a month, an hour a quarter, whatever, or a little money, we can use it. We don't have an office. We don't even have a phone. We have all volunteers. Anybody wishes to help, we want that. And next month, the town halls are free, but we're having a fundraiser on June 18th at Cape High in the big auditorium, the Chantels. The doo-wop band started in the 50s. The leader of that band lives right here and supports the Alliance. And it's going to be a great concert. There's still some tickets available, please go to the website sdarj.org and come on June 18th. It's going to be a tremendous event. Also, we are ecstatic that Dr. Bell will be back on June 30th at 5 p.m. in person at the Lewis Public Library. We are joint venturing with the Lewis Public Library to have another presentation on this topic. It'll be different. As you can tell, there's hours and hours that he can talk about in terms of this general topic and slavery and the impact on American culture and psyche and the like. And we're teaming with the Lewis Public Library and Browse About Books. And there'll be a book signing after that presentation at 5 o'clock on June 30th. But for now, it's about 8:30, and we can't thank you enough, Rick, for coming and sharing with us and helping educate us through the journey we've taken over many, many, many months. It's been incredible. And thank Charlotte, Melinda, and Erica for their great participation here, and everybody who's attending and those who will watch it on YouTube in coming weeks. So thank you all. And Charlotte, do you have any final word for us? Or Dr. Bell?
I think from my vantage point, it's all been said.
And I'll just say I'm sorry to interrupt you, Charlotte. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'll just say very quickly that the talk at the Lewis Library will be different in the sense of it will be shorter than the one you heard. It will be focused on the first half of the things you heard tonight. So if you have a friend who'd like to hear that for the first time, or if you for some reason would really like to hear it for the second time, then come on out. But you will get to ask questions about the book, and if you'd like to have a signed copy, we can certainly provide that as well. So I don't want to mislead anyone. It's a shorter version of the talk you heard tonight at the Lewis Library, live and in person, when I'm healthy and you're healthy too.
Well, thank everybody, and appreciate it, and Calvin, and for behind the scenes, producing this, and Hope. We appreciate that very much. So thank you and good night.
Good night.